Hi, I'm Benjamin Studebaker.
And I'm David McKerracher. You're listening to Why Left.
So today on Why Left, we're going to talk a little bit about nerd stuff, weird stuff, kicked off by Palantir being in the news. Palantir, of course, one of the Lord of the Rings companies. These companies in the kind of Peter Thiel universe that are all, in some way, shape, or form, Lord of the Rings referencing. Anduril is the other quite well-known one. And of course, these companies are named after something from the Lord of the Rings universe. So in the case of Palantir, they're named after the Seeing Stones, the orbs that Saruman and Sauron used to communicate with each other. And at one point, one of these is found along the journey, but it's very dangerous because you see things that you might not want to see. You can be misled about what's going on. You think you know what's going on through these orbs, but you might not know. So they open up lines of communication that would otherwise be impossible over very great distances and allow you to see things that you can't then unsee, that can get in your head and affect the decisions that you make. But they have this enormous power to allow you to see what's going on in a place that it would take you an enormous amount of time in the Lord of the Rings universe to travel to. So they're very powerful and very sought after for that reason. And then, of course, you have Anduril. Anduril is named after Aragorn's sword. Aragorn is the king, the return of the king. He's the one who returns.
Spoiler
King
alert.
of Gondor.
Yeah.
His
He's
sword.
Strider. Yeah.
Yeah, his sword is the famous sword that cuts the ring off of Sauron's finger before the events of the story. And it's the sword that you can use to hold dead people to their oaths and do all kinds of cool and interesting things that you can't do with an ordinary sword. So the idea then is new technology that empowers the king, empowers the state to do things it otherwise would have struggled to do.
Right. And I would say on the one side, this is part of the reason why the idea of Second Amendment, the initial idea of a well-trained militia kind of falls out from under your feet when we're talking about people with rifles from a previous century. When what we're talking about today is AI and drone warfare. So I'll hold up this shot from the week. This shows a soldier sitting there with a drone that is much larger than anything I've seen on the market, but obviously much smaller than a helicopter. They don't need to put a person in there. And what do you call that? Is that the title of this piece? It's Silicon Valley Goes to War. Right. This is from an issue of the week that I got on May 30th, 2025. Benjamin got me into the week. And so we were talking about some of the articles in here. And maybe we'll do this more often. It might become a more regular part of the show. And that's kind of what I was thinking when I became a subscriber to the week was, hey, this way we can kind of get on the same page about some of the current news stuff. And so I want to say, so far, it's been pretty cool. Anne likes to open these up and read little sections of them to me, and maybe we check them out over coffee here and there and stuff like that. Also, as a subscriber, I also get access to their app, and I can listen to articles sometimes. That's a thing that I've done as well. But anyway, this topic in particular is really interesting, and maybe we'll come back to it. I do want to focus more on the Lord of the Rings side today. For reasons that we'll get into, but really quick, I want to say about Palantir, there's a book called The Technological Republic, Hard Power, Soft Belief, and the Future of the West. And it's by the Palantir Technology CEO, Alexander C. Karp, and his co-author, Nicholas Zamiska. And it's a critique of Silicon Valley's retreat from national ambition. It's a critique of consumer capitalism, like explicitly. This guy is saying the West is actually special. And we are being threatened by China, and we need to be putting the powers of Silicon Valley towards the war machine unapologetically. And so he's calling out all these other people at Google or Facebook or whatever, and he's like, you guys are making apps that are making people addicted and unhealthy, and nothing good is coming of it. And in the meantime, we're going to lose the next serious war. And all because you want to pat yourselves on the shoulders as good libertarians who focus on the market as opposed to the state. And he uses example after example of these CEOs from other tech companies being proud that they cut ties with the state in this way or that way. And he's like, why are you guys also anti-state? This is a very bad time to be anti-state. And so it's actually kind of crazy to read it or to listen to it, right? This is a public book. It's meant to be a sort of newsstand bestseller. It's something that if you are traveling by airplane, chances are you will see this book as you're walking through the airport. And so I don't know, that's kind of unnerving and wild to me, but also we live in interesting times. What do you think about that, Benjamin?
Yeah, if you look at the defense sector, the defense sector has these big, fat, traditional companies that have been around for a long time. Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, Boeing. And then you have the tech companies that emphasize disruption. There is kind of a culture clash between the two, and they tend to be focused on quite different things. What Palantir and Anduril have tried to do is bridge this split. So they try to bridge it in both directions. They try to take an emphasis on the state, the national interest, raison d'etat, into the tech sector. And then they also try to take some of the tech sector's disruptive tendencies, its outside the box approaches, into the defense sector. So, of course, the trick is persuading both sides on this point. So to get the tech people to be more interested in something that's more disciplined, which will require them to rein in the way that they live and behave a little bit, because you're not going to get government contracts if you're wild and crazy and you're on ketamine or whatever all the time. And conversely, to get the defense people interested in other ways of designing and producing new technology, new weapons systems that might allow for other kinds of ideas to be taken up in a different way. In particular, part of what they're doing is they are looking to, instead of just competing for government contracts and then executing the language of the government contract, they're trying to come up with new products that the Department of Defense has not yet asked for. And then they're trying to pitch those to DOD. And this is a major change, because in the traditional defense world, it's all about trying to convince the government that you are executing the language of the contract. So a lot of what goes on at a company like Northrop, it's almost like theology. It's, you're trying to show the government that the activity that you're doing is in line with the language in the contract that you competed for and won. And so a lot of it is, look at this activity, and people going, is this activity actually necessary? Does it actually contribute to the contract? Are you ripping us off? And you're going, yes, it does. Even if it seems like it doesn't, it does. And the thing is, it's hard to be sure, because this is incredibly advanced technology, and therefore you can have real debates about what precisely is necessary. No one person can really easily understand all of the things that go on in a complex weapons system like the nuclear program. The replacement for the Minuteman system that Northrop, for instance, is up to. That's a very, very big project. So it's quite hard to convince anybody or show anybody that you actually are doing the things that are necessary. And you can have good faith debates internally within the company or within DOD about whether, in fact, the contract is being followed, with people legitimately believing that they're following it in cases where they might not be. That's the level of complication that you get into ultimately with programs like this. And then you've got companies like Anduril that are looking to instead come up with something that DOD maybe doesn't know that it needs yet and say, hey, DOD, we have this thing. Would you like it? And this is more of an attempt to create a demand that maybe wouldn't have existed previously. So it functions more like innovating with the iPhone, where you consumer, you think that you're happy with your laptop, but did you know that you could get a smartphone? So it takes some of the thinking and some of the practices of the tech sector and tries to outfit them for defense, while at the same time taking the core concerns of the defense industry and using that as a disciplining focus for the tech sector.
Yeah, and it seems to me like Alexander Karp wants to, on the one side, endear the public to his vision. At the same time, he wants to convince more Silicon Valley guys to get on board. And I guess I kind of want to, in our segue back into Lord of the Rings, ask what you make of their usage of Lord of the Rings imagery.
Yeah, so Lord of the Rings is, I think, a huge part of the millennial generation as a consequence of the films. The books had gradually made Lord of the Rings a more significant part of nerd culture over the course of the 20th century. But the coming out of those films at the turn of the century really supercharged Lord of the Rings because all three of those films are great films. None of them are bad. And a lot of millennials saw them at impressionable ages. I would say Lord of the Rings is millennial Star Wars in the sense that Lord of the Rings is the thing that millennials encountered as their major franchise that was or seemed to be nearly perfect in mass culture. So it's had an incredible amount of influence over how millennials think. And millennials of many different political persuasions, to the point where recently there was a piece in Current Affairs by Nathan Robinson in which he goes after conservatives for their appropriation of Tolkien and of Lord of the Rings. And in part, the motivation there is to say that they don't get to own Lord of the Rings. He wants, his claim on it.
And I should also touch on Lord of the Rings was a sort of playful debate recently between Ben Shapiro and Matt Walsh. So
it's also something Stephen Colbert is obsessed with, absolutely obsessed with. So
yeah, that's right.
People all over the political spectrum. Now, Colbert is older, so his Lord of the Rings fan nerd thing is more of a 70s book nerd thing.
Book-based, yeah.
Yeah. And you still have some of that among millennials, of course, but the films allow it to be a much wider and more accessible thing, to the point where if you say something like Palantir, there's a much larger number of people now in the millennial generation who might have the sense of what that is. At the very least, you go on YouTube, you type it in, you can get a clip that will very quickly make it evident to you what it is. And then you might remember, oh yeah, that scene from the movie where Gandalf is telling Pippin, don't look at that thing.
Yeah, or I instantly have
I'll take that.
Flashbacks of people accidentally touching it, and it shows Sauron's eye for a quick flash or whatever. And going with the analogy of the Palantir, bringing close that which is far away, and it's sometimes going to give you deep insight into things, but other times you won't have as accurate information, or it'll be out of context, or it can lead you astray. It also makes people sick, right? Like a person can kind of fall under its spell in a sort of way. And I think of that one sick king who's under Wormtongue's influence. Was there a Palantir involved in that situation as well?
Not directly between them. Saruman has a Palantir. And okay. Saruman's Palantir allows him to communicate with Sauron. The thing is, Sauron knows that Saruman has a Palantir. So because the technology is known by both parties, there's a possibility of influencing what the other one sees. So Sauron uses his Palantir to give Saruman an impression of his capacity and ability, which gradually over time causes Saruman to lose confidence that he can defeat Sauron. Initially, Saruman is just trying to open up a line of communication, see if he can learn things. But Sauron uses this to undermine Saruman's confidence in the possibility of resistance, and then gradually to break and subordinate Saruman. So instead of Saruman getting the jump on Sauron, Sauron gets the jump on Saruman.
Right, and I think that's in the second installment, the Two Towers. That's where...
Some of it happens off book or off screen. It's the explanation for why Saruman defects.
Yeah, and so it is kind of like the smartphone. right? Giving you access to all this information, but there's also people trying to influence you and your idea of what's possible. And then people also get the idea that they can influence the culture back through their phones.
Well, if you have an information gathering technology and the person that you're trying, or the people that you're trying to get information about, know how it works, then they can manipulate the information that you have. If you knew that the government gathered information through a particular route, then you could try to manipulate the impression that the government has by changing what they're exposed to. But if the government has a way of gathering information that you don't understand, then you are likely to miscalculate about how the government gets information about you, and then the government is likely to learn things about you that you might not want them to learn. So having surveillance technology, having information gathering technology that it's not necessarily understood by the party to whom it's subject is very critical for a state that is trying to get good information. As soon as you think that you know how the government gathers information about you, you can start trying to game that system, which is why algorithms, for instance, it's important that people not know how they work. Once you know how they work, then you game them, and then they don't work in the same way that they did before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it creates these weird sort of hall of mirrors, distorting effects as well, right? Where people think that they're influencing in ways that they're not, think that they are circumnavigating the algorithm in ways that they're not, but then also in the ways that they are, the corporations gain a weird, distorted sort of understanding of the populace and vice versa, maybe? I don't know.
And the ultimate trick is to convince somebody that they know how the information gathering works when they don't, right? Saruman thinks that he knows how the information gathering works when he doesn't fully understand it. That's why he can be manipulated through the process.
Yeah.
So if you have someone who thinks they know how the government gathers information, but they don't actually know, then that person is prideful and their hubris makes them vulnerable. But what a lot of people will do is they'll go, aha, see how they're, taking it up from Sauron's point of view? Therefore, it must be evil because they are aligned in some way with the evil character in their interpretation. This becomes very like 2D.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, any state that does information gathering will be interested in creating information asymmetries, not making it so that you have no idea how the state gathers information, but so that you just know enough to think that you know how it works, such that you then try to control what the state knows. And when you do that, then you make mistakes, and then those mistakes give lots of information.
What's the name of the company that the FBI and CIA will actually buy information from? In Psychopolitics, Byung-Chul Han talks about this company. All right. Well, I typed in the question.
Off the top of my head.
Yeah, I'm pulling it up. I've had to look it up multiple times. I wanted to take advantage of it. I wanted to actually use it. I wanted to see, like, what can I actually learn using its big data. The fact is it's interesting that the FBI and the CIA will actually buy data from these companies when it's like, well, wait a minute, didn't the CIA build the internet? Why is it that they will have to buy this information from these companies? And it's like, well, because in a lot of ways they've learned it's effective to just let the free market gather that data, because of course that data has a lot of value to companies as well. And so you just let the market do what it does, and then it's not a civil liberties issue all of a sudden because it's not the state doing it, it's the corporations doing it.
If you've authorized a private company to sell your data, then of course the state can buy the data. You authorize the private company to sell. But if they seize the data, then there would be legal questions about that. There is still a kind of rules-based property system that gives these private companies a right to get some money for the data that they collect. So you end up with public-private partnerships mediated through market relations. And then when you're dealing with these private companies, you don't think of yourself as dealing with the state or giving information to the state. But of course, if you authorize a company to sell your data, why wouldn't the state buy it?
Yeah. Now, there's a lot of these companies like Oracle and Epsilon and LiveRamp and CoreLogic and Equifax. And of course, I have those all memorized and I'm not reading them off of a screen or anything. But the main one that Byung-Chul Han was referencing is Axiom, Axiom. And that's the one I tried to figure out how to use. It's not exactly easy. And it can be useful in certain situations. Like we're talking about how do we get more people out to the farmer's market, locally here, the one that we go to. Well, they used to buy advertising slots on the radio stations, and there were like 200 more people who would show up to the farmer's market. This year, they're not paying for it, and they get way fewer people. But then my dad was like, well, who uses the radio anymore? And, according to the data that was available, like 72 to 75% of adults between the ages of 35 and 45, women specifically, they do. And guess what? That's the demographic that goes to farmers markets, right? And so, data can be very useful. But I wanted to bring it back to the idea that, people think they know how it works and they think they know how to work around it or use it. For instance, any kind of civil liberties conscious influencer is probably selling alongside gold, advertising slots to VPNs, right? Like that's one of the most popular things that you'll see in the world of politics as well. VPNs protect your information, but they only go so far. And when it comes to companies like Axiom, I don't think that they really get the job done.
And a lot of the time, you have to be thinking about not just how do you know what limits do you know about, but what limits do you not know about?
Right.
And something that's offered to you as a way of protecting your information that's advertised to you, probably has limits. Probably.
Yeah, and then people say, "Oh, well, I always put the wrong answers in on surveys. I don't like the things that I like, and then I'll like things that I don't like, just to confuse." I've heard people say these kinds of things, and it's like you as an individual are statistically accounted for. Like they already know that a certain statistical portion of the population is going to do what you're doing. You're already counted into their calculations, right? So, it's the thing about big data.
You've also got, people might also alternatively think that they know absolutely everything about you. Once you get into the space of how can you know, making very positive claims about exactly what's known about you, that's the mistake. Making very positive claims about how the information is gathered and thinking that you comprehend and understand it and can make decisions on the basis of a complete understanding of it. That's the mistake. So, really, you have to conduct yourself in such a way that you're going to be all right.
Yeah, people, come on. Now, back to Lord of the Rings. I want to talk a bit about how it has impacted culture, but I also want to talk a bit about us and our experiences with it. And there was actually something really interesting that you said going into this about how you had to put certain limits on yourself so you didn't go too deep in the deep end with a lot of the different things being sold to us, especially the more nerdy things, right? And so I think the way that came up was somebody in the Theory Underground community, Jacob, had asked you some question that was super niche about Dungeons and Dragons, and you were like, yeah, I didn't go that deep. Right. And so it's interesting. Lord of the Rings is not that deep, right? It is actually pretty mainstream. A lot of people who did not go super deep into this stuff are quite familiar with Lord of the Rings. But then something like Dungeons and Dragons, okay, we've gone a bit more niche. And then knowing niche facts about the different editions, okay, we're way more niche. And then there's the different video games and book series that are really targeting people who kind of build up their entire consumer lives within those niches. And so how did you figure out at some point that you needed to put some limits on that? And I'm gonna run off screen here and listen to you.
One of the ways I've always made decisions in my life is by looking at the people who make these decisions and then seeing what happens to them. What kinds of people do they become as a consequence of these decisions? And do I want to be these people? And what I noticed is that there were certain things that if you took up in nerd culture, they would take over your life and they would make you into a very particular kind of person. And I didn't want to be that very particular kind of person. And this mainly revolved around games that have a very social element. So MMOs, tabletop role-playing games, things like that. I just kind of drew a line and said, I am only really going to get into single player games, or if I play multiplayer games, I'm not going to get involved in any of the social community stuff. I'm not joining clans. I'm not making friends on the internet. I don't want my social world to be games. Games should be separate from social roles that I have involving other people. Games should be an amusement that are a point of recharge for me rather than a way of thinking that I'm part of a community or contributing socially. Because once you mix those things together, then the games won't recharge me for other kinds of activity. They will become the point of life. And once the games become the point of life, then you are reduced to somebody who is just in the world of amusement completely and totally all the time. And that's what I noticed. The hardcore nerds, that's what they become. They become people whose whole life is amusement. People whose horizon of possibility is a job making amusements for other people. Game designers. You know, there comes to be a point where it's not a way of getting into something else. So for me, a lot of the games I liked when I was a kid were kind of history-related games. Sometimes a story game that was a little bit like an RPG that might have some Dungeons and Dragons mechanics, like Dragon Age or KOTOR, Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic. But single-player games, not games with a bunch of other people. And so I would learn a little bit about the mechanics from those single player games because they worked on a lot of mechanics that came from tabletop games or more social games. But I always wanted to be alone with games. Or if I was playing online in a totally anonymized way with no real lasting connection to anybody I played with.
Right. This is not part of your profilicity. You're not on the internet curating your identity, via a profile or your game rank or your clan. And so
yeah, no, if I go play Attila Total War or Crusader Kings 2, I want to relax in a way that allows me to think about some part of history that is interesting for me, and then I want to go back to work. I do not want a bunch of friends who are expecting me to show up, for a holdfast regiment, or they're expecting me to show up to complete some mission in an MMO. Yeah, no, I'm not looking to join a club related to gaming.
Yeah.
I don't tend to like clubs and groups in general very much, but especially not if they're dedicated to amusement.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a really interesting little chapter of my life. So Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter, and maybe a little bit of, some other kinds of books that were in that world. That was very compelling to me between the ages of 14 and, 16. Like, it was really a couple of years, and that was kind of right after I learned how to read, right? Because I was a very late reader, as we've discussed in a previous episode. And so for being able to read Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter was extremely satisfying, but also because I was kind of late to the game, I think it made it less of a it had less of a hold on me. I spent the time that I would have been most into those things if I had learned how to read at a normal age, just playing out in the woods, and I was playing, fantasy scenario. Like I was still being chased by orcs, and playing that I was an elf or what have you. But like that, I didn't have access to that universe outside of my imagination of what that universe was like. Right. It is actually really interesting to. Same with Star Wars. I wasn't allowed to watch Star Wars as a kid, or any of these kinds of fantasy films. but you have the images because you see the posters, and so I'd still, that's enough to work with. That's pretty much all you need to run around and play as a kid. But I really did enjoy those books by the time I got to read them, and then I was kind of on with my life, and I never really looked back. But there was this period, and it was about 8 months long, when I was between 22 and no, I'd say probably more like 21 and 22. When I was realizing the party culture that I was a part of was getting me in trouble, and I was going to get in trouble. Like I wanted to lay low. I was realizing I just kept, I was maxing out this party lifestyle, and I needed to pull back. And my buddy, Chris and I, we were both like, what should we do? Like, we were trying to be healthier, right? We were both working a job, and it was a graveyard shift. And we would talk frequently throughout the night about like life choices and the kinds of lives that we were trying to live. And we didn't quite know yet, but I kind of wanted to switch out of the social scene I was in and buy myself time to think about what was the next big thing I was going to dive into. And so I made a very deliberate choice to get addicted to what I had heard at this point was the most life-consuming video game in the world, right, at the time. Can you guess what it was?
World of Warcraft?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and I did get...
I know a guy who spent a full year of his life in hours on World of Warcraft, and then he was struggling in undergrad because he was playing so much of it. So his parents deleted his account, and then he, ended up dropping out of school for a while and returning home because without the game, it was much harder for him. They didn't realize that by taking the game away, they actually made it much, much more difficult for him to continue.
Yeah, I mean, when you are playing that game, the rest of your life will reorganize around your playing of that game. In the same way that if you were doing heroin, the rest of your life will reorganize around you doing heroin, right? And so it was extremely addicting, and so I was like a level 80 druid tank, number 3 on my server, doing 25-person raids, like at the point that I was maxing on it. And
I never played World of Warcraft at all. At all. I refused to play it at all. Dota 2 is another one of those games. These kinds of games, I do not touch them. Ever.
Yeah, no.
Treat them like hard drugs. Don't touch them.
You should treat them like hard drugs and never touch them. But yeah, thankfully at a certain point, I was having a lot of fun. And then one day, I was walking outside and I was like, I think I've successfully achieved what I was looking to achieve, which was I have subtracted myself from my habitus that I was in. And I've been in this new habitus that allowed me to listen to a lot of, books at that point, right? I'd listened to a lot of books that were meant to give me perspective on life choices and what I wanted to do with my life. And I was like, yeah, I'm ready to get back after building a life, a new kind of life. And one of the biggest realizations at that point, and this is something I want to write about a lot more, and I have written a lot about in relation to Timenergy. I just haven't published a lot of this. But basically, it's the idea that one of the things that games like this are doing is that it's able to take almost everything from life that is fulfilling, and then by truncating the amount of time and effort required to achieve a sense of that, give you a short-term satisfaction that gives you the feeling of actually having done the thing that is fulfilling. So, socializing, being important in your community. And part of the realization was like, yeah, so if in 8 months' time I was able to be a big deal on this server, like actually a contributing member of a guild that does regular raids or what have you, it's like, well, how long does it take to do that in real life? It might take 3 to 5 years as opposed to 8 months. That's what the game is able to do. The game is able to give you a sense of you're there. in a much shorter time. And so, what Chris and I were telling ourselves when we pulled out of it was, oh, so World of Warcraft is basically like real life. It's just way faster. So real life just requires a bit more patience and a lot more grinding. Cool. And then we kind of we just moved on. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great way of describing it, Dave. That really is what those games do. They confuse you. They confuse amusement with real life in a way that gets people very lost.
Yeah, and hate to interrupt, but we would be remiss to not share an advertisement from our sponsors. And we're not sponsored by any corporate or state entities other than ourselves. So I'll just tell you a little bit about some of the past courses and the ongoing courses here at TU. Because if any of them sound exciting to you, well, you can access all of them by becoming a subscriber. That's right, subscribers make all of this possible. Subscribers get access to the course I taught on Martin Heidegger's Being and Time, as well as the course that I taught the first half of last year, Emmanuel Levinas's Totality and Infinity, the second half for which I will be teaching this winter. I've also taught Critical Media Theory and Critical Doxology and Time Energy with my wife, Ann Snellgrove McKerracher, who is the co-host on What's Right. Also, you would get access to the course I taught at the university, 3 semesters worth, on Intro to Critical Social Theory and Socioanalysis. But also, we've had lots of other great professors teach Introduction to Marxism by Chris Catrone, Intro to Lacan via Seminar 11 with Todd McGowan, Introduction to Ivan Illich with Brian Weeks, The Clinical Structures of Psychoanalysis and Autism with Dr. Leon Brenner, the Michael Downs Seminar, Introduction to Slavoj Žižek, Introduction to Nick Land, and Žižek's For They Know Not What They Do, all taught by Michael Downs, as well as What is Sex? There was a collab that I did with Cadell Last. Theory 101, a collab I did with Hello Gorgias. And then also, of course, there's Carl Jaspers' Is the Idea of the University, PMC Consciousness and Ideology. These were early, very important courses that I taught with friends at TU back in 2023. And they remain important to this day. Every one of these courses comes out of an overarching research project. There's a real driving force, mission, and agenda to the research going on at TU because we want to understand the situation for the sake of large-scale structural change focused on the good life. What does that actually mean? If you really want to go deep, obviously, these courses are something you could spend the better part of a year binging while at work. Ongoing courses that come out on a monthly basis are the Fundamental Problems and Core Concepts at TU with yours truly. Also, my seminar, Philosophy of Nature with Nina Power, the Benjamin Studebaker seminar, as well as his course, The 12 Political Theorists. We've got some really exciting stuff coming down the line. The only way to make this all possible and really deepen your knowledge and familiarity with all of these different things is to become a subscriber today at http://theoryunderground.com/subscribe. Thank you.
A lot of people just go from game to game and they never get out of it. If they get tired of one of them, they just change which one. And
right. And so it makes it very easy to get stuck in it forever. And so I'm glad that there were reasons that you were early in thinking, oh yeah, I'm not going to do this full bore. I'll have limits on it and not turn it into my social life. Which meant that you were able to be social in other spheres where people probably weren't even into, say, Lord of the Rings or what have you, right? Whereas if you're a part of a Dungeons and Dragons community, it's like, well, Lord of the Rings is the gateway. And then after that, it's just like an endless universe.
And once you socialize in a silo, then your sense of norms become distorted as a consequence of this. And particularly, it's less true maybe now where the young people are much more overwhelmingly online. But when I was a kid in the 90s and 2000s, if you were extremely online, this was going to separate you. It usually involved to some degree your parents' class background, giving you access to a PC, giving you access to that stuff. And so if you spent a lot of time with the other kids on the internet who had PCs at home and could shut the door, you were going to very quickly become quite socially estranged from the people around you. And it would always be easier rather than try to find a way to get along with and understand the people that in your community in real life. It would always be easier to retreat back into the digital. So I never gave myself the option of digital friends.
Whoa. Yeah. That's deep too. The idea that there's only a certain type of person who's going to be able to have unrestricted access to a PC with their door closed. Right.
Yeah, and I didn't want an insular conversation with other people who were in that kind of situation.
Hmm.
I wanted to be able to get along with the people who were outside.
Yeah.
And I saw what happened to the people who never got along with the people outside. These people became very limited in terms of what they could do in their lives because of this dependence.
Right.
And now we're at a stage where this seems to be less of a problem, I think, for Zoomers because there's a much greater percentage of that generation that is online and has in some way mixed the worlds. So we used to talk about parasocial dynamics, but this kind of mixing of the digital with your sense of who you are is now routinized to the point where dating even occurs in this kind of mediatized way. So all of this would have been stuff that when I was a kid, if I were doing it, it would have made me weird. It would have made me not able to get along with other people. Now it's stuff that it seems like you kind of have to be able to do. So when I talk about it, it might seem a little anachronistic to people who are younger. And I think around the period of the Big Bang Theory, there was a kind of pivot and an attempt to sort of normalize the stuff that had been formerly estranging you from the rest of society. I think that stuff still does estrange you from the rest of society, but now it estranges perhaps a whole generation from older generations, rather than a part of a generation from the rest of that generation. The effect of it, when I was a kid, was that if you were more digital, I noticed that you would have more in common with people who were a little younger for whom the computer take-up rate would be higher. So if you were a late millennial, this would give you more in common with Zoomers because your level of digital exposure and the degree to which internet norms had influenced you was going to be higher. And then there would be more separation from the late millennials who were not on the computer, who would be more like early millennials, who in turn are more like Gen Xers, in the degree to which the internet for them is something they are adopting or reluctantly, to various degrees, converted to. People who got Facebook in college versus people who had it when they were teenagers and for whom it was part of their formative social experience. Once you get it at a point where you're already an adult, it's distorting a set of norms that you already have and a sense of normal that you already have. But if you get it as you are yourself maturing, then it's part of maturing. So it becomes adolescence.
Yeah, I wonder to what degree it has been normalized for a whole generation. But I'll say there's still definitely a cut between the people who go all in on World of Warcraft and or whatever it could be. What's the more PvP based version?
Fortnite.
Yeah, oh, Fortnite. Yeah, which is way less fantasy based and way more just kind of action shooter. I mean, back when I was playing World of Warcraft, a lot of people were playing Call of Duty, right? Which would be the sort of analog, right?
Yes, and some of those shooters have clans in them or kind of community building systems that you can take too far. But I have noticed that the trend in the newer games is to take mechanics that were formerly for very hardcore segments and to kind of roll them out for larger parts of the population in a more casualized way.
Oh wow, what's an example of that?
Well, for instance, the loot boxes, the 2K. I also very much like basketball and have been a longtime player of NBA Live and NBA 2K, which used to be an almost completely single-player experience. Then it became possible to play online with strangers in kind of random matches. Then it became possible to go to the neighborhood and to play on community courts and organize teams and have like regular leagues that meet for pickup basketball in a virtual park.
Oh no.
And as it begins to become more like World of Warcraft, but for basketball. Now, not everybody who plays 2K takes it that far, but some people do. And probably the closest I ever came to having a community was playing 2K and having people that you played with online who would then friend you, and then they'd invite you to more games. And gradually you could get into the habit of playing regularly with certain people, and it can kind of sneak up on you. And I'm like, wait a second, is 2K trying to turn into World of Warcraft on me?
Oh my
And then
gosh. Yeah.
you're people are paying money to get outfits so that when their player shows up at the park, he looks cool.
Oh no.
Yeah,
Right.
and there's a casino element to that. And 2K has gradually become a lot like a much nerdier kind of game, but it's still NBA 2K. It's a huge game that's, extraordinarily popular with a large section of the public. So it doesn't seem like when you play 2K that you're joining, very, very, what we would consider very cringe parts of 90s or 2000s nerd culture. But actually you are, if you
Okay.
take it that far, if you take it
Wow.
up in that way.
Yeah, and there was a sort of red flag for me because I never really played Fortnite, but I met my one of my best friends, his daughter. She was like, "Yeah, Grandpa bought me a dress in Fortnite," and I was like, "Oh, that's wonderful. How much was the dress?" She goes, $70, and I was just like, "That's the price of a game." Like that. Games used to be a lot cheaper, by the way, first of all. But $70 for a dress in a game, that's something else. And so, you could get a real dress for that much. Like you could get a real dress and actually go somewhere with
Yeah.
that dress. You know?
Yeah, but if your social world is more based in the game than it is in real life, then it's more important to look good for the other people in the game than it is to look good in real life. If you actually do mix the worlds, then it does genuinely become the case that your reputation, the place where it matters the most, how you are received, is within the context of the game.
Okay. And
This is the
so
thing that I was very much bent on avoiding. And
it's
also, it colors the way I engage with politics online today, where I am quite keen to avoid, and it affects this conversation. It affects all of this, everything that I do, to get caught up in a social community around talking about politics online that would alienate me and isolate me from the thing itself, which occurs offline.
right. Right.
Still substantially offline, despite the fact that it has this appearance increasingly, and you're encouraged to think of it as something that you can immediately enter into online.
Right. Right. And a lot of what I do with Theory Underground comes from having burnt out with IRL activism, right? And so if there's a lot of people at TU who have burnt out with this real life activism, but at the same time, more than a few of us, and I'll just speak for myself though, have no desire to just keep it online for the rest of our lives. Like that's not the point. The point is to get back out there and do things. Whether they will be even similar or not is a different question, and that's an important question.
Yeah, but the blurring is genuine, though, which does mean that there's a sense in which you could not be fully engaged with political stuff and be totally offline. If you were totally offline now, that would also be majorly disadvantaging, and it would cause you to be weird. Now being offline also makes you weird, and you don't really have an obvious way of navigating this that preserves your ability to talk across it. So when I talk about when I was a kid in the 90s and 2000s, it's very clear there that being online is the thing that isolates you, makes you weird. That becomes more muddled as more people go online and take it up, and as the cohorts where more people go online and take it up age and become larger parts of the adult population, it all becomes more difficult. And the sense that there's any kind of norm or normal or any kind of expectation you could have in terms of social capacity on the part of the whole population, this is increasingly called into question and becomes doubtful. So it's not like you can simply get off the internet. That's not a solution to this. Certainly not now. If it, maybe when you in the 90s, if you were, 10, it might have seemed like a solution if you're 8 or 12, but not now. So the stuff that I did to maintain an ability to talk to older people or people who didn't come from the same kind of family background, that stuff would not obviously have the same effects if you deployed it now, particularly if you were the age that I was at the point at which I was deploying those tactics. That said, I still think there's a good rule to be observed about not making a game your place where you think you have a social role.
Right.
A meaningful social role where you are interfacing with the good by your contribution to a community. That's the thing that I think in any era you have to be very careful about.
Yeah, one little test there is like the woman test, right? If the social life that you're going super deep into has women as a obvious minority, like if there's only like 2% are women or only 20% are women, if it's in that range, I don't know. For me, that was kind of always like a red flag. It's like, well, you should definitely have a social life outside of the thing that you're into, where there's a much better mixture of people, intergenerational and male and female. Just you don't find yourself doing tabletop games where only like there's like that one gal and she's really cool. It's like no, like that's great. She's cool. The tabletop games are great, but do you have a life outside of that?
Yeah, part of what is happening is that there's an alternative set of these things that are women leaning or women dominated and equally nerdy, really, but catering to a different sexual or gendered split. We see this a lot with the cosplaying and the some of this book talk, bookstagram, visual, sort of, excuse me, not visual novel, although sometimes visual novel, but this kind of the romance genre being taken up in a kind of very hardcore fandom-y way,
right,
online. That's one of the things that I'm noticing and seeing. Fandoms around television shows, anime.
Anne is
there's
very
a lot
put out by the book talk
stuff.
thing. I think she wants to talk about it on a What's Right episode soon about this. There's a whole thing about that I haven't really seen too much into it, but I want to use bringing up Anne as a segue here back into Lord of the Rings, because the one thing I really want to make sure we do with this episode is there's something fun that we get to say. And so, Anne, in her K through 12 experience, was very put off by the fantasy fandom groupings at the school. They were basically, she had friends that got sucked into them, and they basically required going in the deep end into all of this nerdy stuff. And then, and just was like, she was trying to be a good student, and also she got into theater, and she was also doing debate. And debate can take over your life, theater can take over your life, trying to be a good student can take over your life, right? All of these things can take over your life. So but she was doing enough of them that no one of them took over her life. And of course, because the nerdy fantasy fandom side of things is so all sort of all world consuming, it's a totalizing side of things. There was no possibility that she could get into it to the level that would be cool with those people who got sucked into it. And so she was kind of put off by it. And in being put off to it, she was also put off to Lord of the Rings in general and Harry Potter in general and all of these things. Now she's older and wants to get into Lord of the Rings. And so I thought we could also say something about that for those kinds of people who want to approach Lord of the Rings as literature, not as entry into a social fandom. And maybe that's kind of how this thing started, was talking about its cultural significance, right?
When I was 9, that was when I was first introduced to Lord of the Rings by my 4th grade teacher. And I initially was skeptical of it. I said, why should I get all absorbed in this fake world that isn't real? I want to learn about the real world. And of course, there is something you can learn about the real world by reading fiction, if it's the right kind of fiction and you take it up in a serious way, and not as some kind of escape to give you an ersatz of a social role because you're not doing well in the schooling system. And of course, that was how he presented it to me to invite me into it. It was, well, if you think about this as a set of metaphors, and you recognize that they're metaphors, so they, of course, have limits, what can you nonetheless learn? What can you get exposed to in terms of other ways of thinking and seeing things that you might not easily immediately get exposed to in your day-to-day routine in the particular time, place, community in which you're living? And if you take up stories that way as ways of trying to get into human themes, then that can be a disciplining mechanism that can help you avoid getting lost in them. One of the things that I have always tended to do if I read a story is to ask if it follows kind of Hobbes's rules, a sort of Hobbesian logic about a realistic kind of world. And if it doesn't, to be aware that it doesn't, and then to not necessarily look to it to tell you very much about things that are to do with that. So, the kind of three basic Hobbes rules that I use when evaluating a fictional universe is there a kind of rough equality? Not to say that all the characters are equally smart, equally skilled, equally powerful, but could any of the characters hurt one of the others? Or are some of the characters immune to being hurt by others? Or extraordinarily, extraordinarily difficult to touch, just by virtue of certain special natural abilities or talents that they have, not through any kind of social organization. Secondly, do you have separation of persons? Do the characters not know what one another are thinking and feeling from time to time? Do they not have access to each other's minds? Is there questions of trust in the story? Is there a possibility of communication failure or miscommunication? Or does everybody understand everybody effortlessly and easily in the story? And then the third major parameter, it's separation of persons, rough natural. Scarcity. Are there things that people in the story want that conflict with things other people in the story want? Is it always possible for everybody in the story to get what they want all at the same time? Or are there sometimes trade-offs, cases where what you want sharply conflicts with what someone else wants, and there is no way of you both winning? Do you occasionally have zero-sum, win-lose, lose-lose situations? Not that every situation necessarily is this way, but is this part of the world? So a story like Lord of the Rings, of course, has certain power inequalities. Like, there are wizards in Lord of the Rings. There are some people who live forever and other people who have a finite natural lifespan. There are certain natural inequalities that to some degree limit the degree to which some of the characters can be touched by others. This can be a way of creating a sense of the mystical or the magical, and it can kind of draw kids in. But then as you're reading the story, you have to remember, insofar as it's on the basis of just sharp natural difference, it's misleading. Only if it's a metaphor for some other kind of social difference can it be potentially helpful for understanding real human life situations. So Gandalf cannot simply beat all of the bad guys by being a great wizard. He has to socially organize together the fellowship. So his magic doesn't simply dominate the story. Yes, he has magic and it makes him kind of intriguing, but this is not something which gives him a win. And he has to deal with entities that are comparable to him in strength that also have the ability to organize people. Now, where you could start to push on it is, well, it seems like certain characters have a kind of destiny about them to be leaders as a consequence of nature, right? Aragorn comes from a certain bloodline, so he can wield a certain sword. Gandalf has certain wizard powers, which make him distinct from other, because he's a different kind of spirit entity from them, right? So some of this stuff, if you take this up too straightforwardly, could lead you into a quite hierarchical way of thinking about, some people are special, other people aren't special. But The Lord of the Rings as a story is continuously trying to subvert and undermine that, in part by having Gandalf emphasize the necessity of hobbits. So even though Gandalf is a wizard and has much more power than the hobbits, Gandalf thinks that the way to do things is to organize together these expeditions of hobbits and dwarves. These are beings with finite lifespans that are much less wise than him, much less capable than him. But for him, they're indispensable creatures that you have to organize and work with. You cannot simply have the wizards get together with the elves and do something without the dwarves and the hobbits and the men. That would not work. And it's Saruman who thinks that because he's powerful and because he's wise, that he should just get together with other powerful and wise people and stitch things up on that basis.
Oh, yeah, that's true. Yep.
And he has a kind of hubris in thinking that his wisdom is sufficient, and he has a kind of contempt for the other beings in the universe that don't have these qualities and skills.
There's also multiple sort of culturally based conceptions of the good that are not, I mean, they might be mutually exclusive from a cultural level. They don't necessarily have to conflict. But also, I mean, Shire life for hobbits, mining under mountains life for dwarves, and the sort of being in, I don't know, what's characteristic of the good life for the elves. I mean, it in part is building beautiful cities and being a part of their forests, right?
The elves are virtuous in the most classical theological kind of sense. The elves are, generally quite virtuous to the point where if you corrupt an elf, you get an orc, right? If you corrupt an elf, you get something that can't possibly be an elf. So there's a kind of emphasis on a classical notion of virtue, which is dying, and dying in modernity. It's not possible to have rule by elves or to have the elves be the dominant factor. So the elves are still there. There are some of them, but they're a declining and diminishing factor. And therefore, it's necessary, if you're to have some kind of world that is good, to be able to make use of the good that is in men or the good that is in dwarves or the good that is in hobbits. If you can't find any good in these things, then you will leave the world. And some of the elves are doing this. They're leaving the world. They're setting off to go into the West. So they're going to the land of the gods, of the spirits, and they're going to leave the living world because they don't think that men have what it takes to produce anything good and to stand up ultimately to evil. So this is a debate that the wizards are having. The wizards are meant to be the wisest people. They're committed to the good. And there's an intense debate between Saruman and Gandalf that isn't always out in front because they're both more committed to the good than they are to this difference, right? But an intense difference in terms of the tendency to think that the solution must come from elves or the solution must come from the council, the wisest people, and a tendency to think that the solution must come from the weaker factions and groups, the spiritually, morally, ethically weaker factions and groups. And it's Saruman coming to believe that there isn't enough power among the wise and powerful groups to defeat Sauron that leads him to think that there has to instead be cooperation. Because for him, the idea that you could work with the hobbits and even the men ultimately, this is increasingly off the table because for him, these groups are not able to be relied upon. He eventually gets to a point where he's looking at, well, who still has capacity? It's too narrow a part of the population. And therefore, on this basis, he goes, well, I guess Sauron is inevitable and we have to acquiesce and cooperate. And Sauron exaggerates his power, exaggerates the degree to which he's been successful all the time in his communication. And when Saruman is only talking to Sauron, when he's only in dialogue with Sauron, and he doesn't even talk to the men or the elves or the dwarves because he has contempt for them, of course, he just develops more and more this perception that Sauron is inevitable and Sauron's mode of civilization, mode of life is inevitable. And there seems to him to be less and less possibility of resistance. When he confronts somebody like Gandalf, Gandalf to him seems to be idealistic and naive.
Yeah, because he trusts the little guys. Or he doesn't, or at least he invests in the little guys. Right, he's betting on the little guys. It's not just,
Right.
Yeah.
But, conversely, you could make a case, and some people do this. Some people, will say that Gandalf is a manipulator. And some of the other characters will say this. Some of the kings of men, some of the dwarves get ticked off at Gandalf because they see Gandalf as somebody who's trying to wield them or move them as pieces on a board. that Gandalf tries to use the fact that he's wiser than them to machine them into the roles that he thinks they need to play ultimately. So there is this, and there's a reason that Gandalf cannot take the ring himself. If Gandalf takes the ring himself, because Gandalf is this kind of entity, he would then become a dominator of the groups that he's ostensibly trying to help. Because there is a gap between him and them in consciousness. He is much wiser than them. If he did take up the ring, then he would be invited to dominate them.
And the
Hobbit can hold the ring in part because the Hobbit is not capable of exercising dominion in any case.
Right.
And it seems obviously fanciful to a Hobbit to try to do that.
Well, and you brought up with your 3 criteria for good world building. Also that, there's this kind of rough equality between everyone. Everyone's vulnerable to one another in some sense. And also, like, no one's omnipotent or omniscient, right? And the one of the ways that people are not omniscient or omnipotent, right? In the case of Gandalf, not only is he vulnerable, he to other level 80 characters or what have you, he also doesn't just know everything, and he actually he can't just use magic to know things either. He actually had to go read books. He had to go study in the archives for a long time. He had to get to the bottom of what are these rings and how do they work. Like, he didn't just know this, and so he entrusts it to Bilbo, and that's kind of where the Fellowship starts off with, is the passage of the ring from Bilbo to Frodo, and whether it will even pass. Can Bilbo let go of it? And so on this, I kind of want to ask you then, do you think a person getting started with Lord of the Rings as great literature rather than fandom, should they start with The Hobbit or should they start with The Fellowship?
Oh, The Hobbit. Read The Hobbit first.
Really?
The Hobbit is set before the Fellowship takes place anyway.
Yeah.
And it's also really easy and incredibly quick to read relative to The Lord of the Rings is not hard to read, but it's harder to read than The Hobbit is.
Yeah. Yeah.
The Hobbit is really originally written for children. You can fly through The Hobbit. The Hobbit is written such that kids under 10 can easily read it.
Yeah. It's also fun. Like, it's more cute, I think. Lord of the Rings is like, ooh, it's intense somewhat. It's like it's a big deal.
Yeah, because Lord of the Rings, they're trying to deal with the big bad. And in The Hobbit, they have a more delimited quest, which is to go and get the mountain back from the dragon that's taken it. Just the dragon, not all of the sources of evil in the world, but just the dragon. Can you go to the mountain? Can you recover the gold, or can you? Maybe the dragon is dead. You can reestablish dwarven civilization in the mountain. Can you do something of this kind? And you have the dynamics, because for most of the story, Gandalf is missing, and this is also something that Tolkien strategically does, in part to avoid Gandalf's magic taking over the story. He removes Gandalf from the plot, or puts Gandalf in particular places for long periods of time, so that they have to socially deal with problems among themselves without recourse to Gandalf.
Cool. So it meets the 3 criteria for world building, and we should keep in mind that it's a set of metaphors for thinking about life. What about for history, for understanding history? Have you found it useful in some way for thinking about history?
Well, so when you're a kid, I think a lot of kids want to be particular characters. They're kind of drawn to particular characters. And then you see among young people who try to get involved in politics, sometimes there's a sort of taking up of a fantasy mentality. In my book, my first book, the subtitle for it is The Way is Shut, which is a reference to Aragorn looking to hold these dead guys to an oath. So these guys swore an oath to a previous king of Gondor that they would defend Gondor. They broke their oaths, so the king cursed them to live as ghosts in the mountain until they uh, keep their word. But because the line of kings in Gondor has gone missing, there's no king around who can hold them to their oaths. So they have no way of getting out of the mountains. They're trapped there because they can't keep their promise to a king. So at one stage, it's decided that maybe their help would be useful. So Aragorn goes into the mountains to find them, and they mock him initially because they go, "Well, we can't follow you, and we're so tired of being in these mountains, we just kill and haunt them. So we kill anybody who comes here because we've decided if we're stuck here, nobody else can be here. It's just for us." Uh, so he has to reveal that he has the sword, Anduril, the sword of the king, and that he is in fact the king. And when this is revealed, they go, "Oh, okay. So then we'll hold our oath, and then you'll free us from it, right?" And he's able to convince them of this because he is the king, and because he has the charisma of a king. He talks, he acts like a king, and he has the sword. So they participate in one of the major battles as a consequence of this, and then he keeps his word and he lets them die fully and completely and dissipate and go into the West. So sometimes you see people who think that they are Aragorn, or that other people should respond to them like they're Aragorn. So they want people to see that they're the leader, that they're the one who should be followed, and they want this recognition to give them power in the community. But of course, this is where things can get a little misleading because Aragorn is in a bloodline of kings and has a special sword. And so when he shows up and goes, "I'm Aragorn, I have the sword," people go, "Oh, you're Aragorn, you have the sword." No one in real life in the United States today is Aragorn and has the sword. But a lot of people can sometimes take up this part of it. And if it's not this, then it's taking up Superman or one of those superhero movies and identifying with the empowered character who, because they have special powers, is treated differently in the universe by everybody else. And this is where the natural inequality, if you break it in a story, it can mislead your reader. Because if your reader identifies with the powerful character, and kids are often inclined to do this, they're often inclined to identify with powerful characters, then if you go around thinking I'm a powerful character, people should respond to me because I'm powerful. Well, for one, are you actually powerful? Nobody is in our life. Nobody has the ability to snap their fingers and make this or that happen on the basis of sheer will in our life. That's not how things get done in human affairs. So if you start to think like that, it can kind of mislead you. So in the book, I talk about the kind of wannabe Aragorn figure as a sort of trope in contemporary politics. There's just so many university-educated wannabe discourse sorcerers out there, wannabe Aragorns out there, who think that because they are smart or they use words well or they're good at constructing language, that people should follow them. A lot of people in the kind of populism space think this way. Even people who think of themselves as champions of ordinary people think that they're clever, they use words well. If they use words in the right kind of way, people should follow them. This way of thinking produces large numbers of people, for one, all of whom are trying the same thing. I think it becomes evident to most of the people who watch content online that these people are trying to manipulate them or machine them with language in various ways. It's not real leadership because you're not actually getting anything done for these people. You're not actually helping them in any kind of concrete way that would make you deserving of their support or of them following you. And yet there's an expectation that these people develop that comes, I think, in many cases out of a one-sided, narrow engagement with sci-fi and fantasy, that they should just show up and then be followed. And if people don't follow them, that they're wrong. They're bad for not following them. After all, who doesn't follow the king of Gondor? Only people who refuse to recognize who he is. And why would they refuse to recognize who he is? Because they have ill intentions.
Mm-hmm. Or they're foolish.
Mm-hmm. they're stupider than him or they're worse than him in some way. And then this becomes the way of explaining why people don't follow you.
Cool. Well, I'm excited to read these, to reread these now that I'm, not a teenager, and also through the lenses of all the philosophy and theory that I've gained over time, and then with Anne, kind of getting to see them with fresh eyes, and then maybe we'll get to do a follow-up episode once she has gone through at least The Hobbit. We'll start with that, and it's a lot lower stakes. I think that she'll dig the fact that it is lower stakes because, especially with Marvel movies nowadays, it's like almost every one of these movies, the whole world is at stake. Everything is in the balance, and it's like you can only do that so many times. You can't keep having movies where the whole world's hanging in the balance. So
yeah, the Hobbit, you can just sit through that. She'll be done with the Hobbit in a few days at most. It won't take her long at all.
Cool. All right, folks, we're gonna close this one out. This was also a test in whether we can do streaming with my new setup. I don't really think I can. But it looks like David Ruiz was here for the unlisted version of this. I think he's here right now. And so shout out to Ruiz, shout out to Jacob. Ruiz is saying that there was no buffering that he's seen. So we might be able to do streams after all, at least while I'm in this space. And so that could be cool.
How about that?
That could be fun. Yeah. All right, everybody. Benjamin, thank you so much. Everyone, take care.
Thanks, guys.
All right. Go read Lord of the Rings if you haven't. Let us know what you think. Take care. Subscribers get access to all past courses at Theory Underground, from Chris Catrone to Michael Downs, as well as ongoing courses taught by David McKerracher, Benjamin Studebaker, and Nina Power. Subscribers also get access to monthly research seminars, and the higher tiers of involvement unlock discussions and one-on-one small group tutelage. So if you're like me and you're never a huge bookish kind of person, but somewhere along the way you got really into listening to educational materials, if you got really into listening to podcasts and then books at work, if you love going deep into ideas, but you're just not a traditional bookish kind of person, well, this is where the alliance between people like us and people who are more bookish and specialized are able to meet to work through these things and do so in defense of the human, in defense of our dignity, in defense of our common humanity and our intellectual integrity. This is not a place where we're going to kick you out because you're pro-life or pro-choice, or where you are an atheist or a agnostic or a Christian. But it is a place where you're expected to love one another regardless of such things, and to show up for people in your actual IRL real life communities regardless of such things. And if that is exciting for you, and if you're excited to learn about what this approach, this method, this school of thought has to offer, then I'm excited to meet you. Subscribe today. Thank you.